And that's it. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Our first speaker is going to be Ilona. Ilona has been working for 20 years as an economic analyst and joined Vox Ukraine a couple of years ago. Vox Ukraine is one of the leading Ukrainian think tanks. And now Ilona is an editor for Vox Ukraine and will tell us about the damage to Ukraine's infrastructure and Ukraine's reconstruction. So, Ilona, the stage is yours.
Okay, so this is the summary of my today's presentation and the main points I will be making in the next 20 minutes. So that Ukraine's recovery, Ukraine's transition since 1991 was perhaps the slowest among the so-called post-Soviet or Eastern European states. It intensified since 2014, since the Euromaidan, but of course it could have been much faster. But it's probably as good as you could get with the state of the society and Russian interventions and so on. And at the end of my presentation, I will provide some ideas for the reconstruction, which will be soon published in the book, which a group of authors of which I was an editor with my colleagues. So, and one important thing I would like to add that Ukrainian society is practically 100% sure that Ukraine will win this war, of course, with the help of our allies, because we have no other choice but winning. So, and in this presentation, I will cover these points in this order. We see on this slide that Ukraine had a very slow economic development compared to other Eastern European countries. Ukraine is this dark blue line. And we see that first the transition during the 1990s has seen a big downturn, and then we see that 1998 crisis had a big adverse effect. Then 2014-15 Russian attack and economic crisis had a big adverse effect. And the recovery in these instances was slow because Ukrainian small and medium businesses is not that much developed as in other countries, and this small business, it what gives you the flexibility and the adjustment of the economy. If we look at per capita terms, the situation may seem a little bit better, but one should take into account that between 1991 and 2021, Ukraine had a reduction of population by approximately 10 million. So now it's like 41 million population, whereas it was 52 million in 1991. And that was both due to greater mortality than birth rate and due to emigration of population to other countries. Immigration was quite small and was not able to compensate for the reduction of population. What are the reasons for this situation with economic growth? Some people may say that it is the structure of the economy, the predominance of heavy industry that was since the Soviet time, and this industry suddenly lost its competitiveness when the economy opened in 1991. But this was not the main factor. As we can see from the structure of economy of Ukraine on this figure, the restructuring was mostly over by the year 2000. So The share of services went up from 30% in 1992 to 55% in 2000 and to 65% in 2021. So not so big increase in the last 20 years. And respectively, the share of industry fell from 43% in 1992 to 25% in 2000 and to 20% in 2021. However, during this 1990s transition, people who we now call oligarchs were able to capture these big chunks of outdated Soviet industry, and more importantly, they were able to capture the state, basically to have much political influence. And with having this political influence, they were able to impact the rules of the game and to basically keep their competitive advantage, so to say, and to keep the economy or to protect their inefficient assets from the competition. Thus, the main problem of Ukraine is institutions which were captured, and among the institutions, of course, the biggest problem is the judicial system, and this is continuously recognized by businesses as the main obstacle to investment, to the development, and so on. Of course, certainly if you don't have anything to enforce the laws and to enforce contracts, then it's really hard to expect large investment, and certainly there was underinvestment in Ukraine during this period of time. If we look at the structure of exports, we see that exports restructured quite substantially during the last 20 years, and these are industries there that are actually competitive on the international scale, right? Because these industries are exporting and they're competing with firms from other countries. And we see that the share of agriculture grew a lot for the last 20 years. The share of metals declined. And we also see a big change in the structure of exports of services. Basically, the IT services share increased from 0.5% in 2000 to almost 5% in 2021. And one of the important factors behind that was, as it may sound, something done by Leonid Kuchma in 2001. Of course, here I might imagine he didn't foresee these consequences, but this was the introduction of the simplified taxation system in 2001. And while we clearly know the drawbacks of that system, so that it allows tax evasion and so on, but it was the factor that allowed to develop a number of, or a class of people who are small entrepreneurs, self-employed people, or freelancers, however we may call them. But these people, the number of these people grew, and they were one of the very important factors behind both 2004 and 2014 Maidans, behind the development of the IT sector, and also behind the whole volunteer movement that appeared since, or intensified since 2014, and of course that is very active right now. These people were also behind some important reforms that were implemented since 2014, such as public procurement reform, for example. Now let's look at the pace of reforms. This is the index compiled by Vox Ukraine, by our organization, since early 2015, and this is kind of quantitative estimate of the pace of reform performed by expert survey. We have about 40 experts who provide their expected economic impact of some regulations adopted by Ukrainian government in the broad sense. And we see that the reforms were most intense in the early 2015 when the situation was really, really bad and the hryvnia was fallen and everybody was thinking whether the Ukrainian economy would collapse tomorrow or not. But mostly the reforms were incremental, but the good news is there that they were mostly positive. So so above the zero is the reforms that bring Ukraine closer to the more investor-friendly, more integrated with Europe and so on. So these are positive reforms. And this figure supports what I just said, that reforms were mostly like step by step, very incremental, although we see some big step in, for example, fighting corruption, like introduction of anti-corruption agencies, already mentioned procurement reform. Some deregulation has also taken place, and this was helpful in eliminating opportunities for corruption. Of course, the banking sector reform was very helpful. And let's look at these reforms in the term. On this slide, I presented some changes that can be considered relative successes or relative failures. And you should not view them as complete successes or complete failures, right? For example, in the judiciary sphere, some very important legislation was adopted, but implementation is seeing many difficulties, and there are very important vested interests that oppose this reform, but nevertheless some important steps there have been made. Likewise, in the decentralization, the progress has been much faster. We see a lot of, we see actually already some material results of the reform. And most importantly, we see that people start being more responsible, start feeling more responsible about their communities, about what they do or what they can do for their village, for their city, and so on. And we see also emergence of some grassroots leaders at the local level. So we already see some material results of these reforms. Although, of course, there can be progress. Yeah. We can make still some steps to improve it. The same with the banking sector, for example. If it was not for the cleanup of banks in 2014 and 2015, today we would probably have much worse situation than we have now. Now we see that the banking system works. No banks are falling. Just a couple of small banks were resolved since February 24th, and so on. So we see this, that what we've done in the previous years actually pays off right now, but we still have some quite important institutional reforms to make. So the damage on Ukraine, of course, has been enormous. This is the estimation of damages as of September 1st. Now, of course, it is quite high because the energy sector has been bearing a lot of damages from these recent missile attacks. Although it's amazing how quickly they restore the infrastructure, but of course some damages require a lot of time to deal with, because some equipment is not easily replaceable. But nevertheless, we see that Ukrainian rescue teams and repair teams do really miracles in repairing the infrastructure. There are already some estimates of how much the repair, the reconstruction, I would say, will cost. One estimate was done as of June 1st, and of course it covers only a small part of damage. This was the estimate performed by the World Bank, and they provided $350 billion. Some more recent estimates provide as much as over $1 trillion need for reconstruction, but in any case, you can imagine that the need will be huge. More important is, however, the human cost of war. It's not only the lost lives, but it's also refugees, people who needed to run from the country, who needed to leave their homes and somehow try to settle in another place to Ukraine. Many people lost their jobs. The estimate of unemployment is about 30 to 35%, and it is high amount. And of course, the impact that will be prolonged, that probably will be hurt, will be felt in the next decades, is impact on education, impact on health. The impact on education is specifically the lost years of schooling. So that first the pandemics disrupted schooling, and now of course the war, and somehow this impact will need to be compensated. What other impact the war has provided is, of course, it hugely increased uncertainty. So that you could look at the scales of this graph and see that in October the forecast is much more uncertain compared to what it was in January, and now the people are adjusting their forecasts because this forecast was produced in early October, but now with those missile attacks, unfortunately, we are afraid that next year the GDP will also fall by a small amount, like 5%. But of course, this is also uncertain, and if the attacks continue at the current scale, we can see even worse outcomes. So I think the conclusions from this discussion are pretty clear, that Ukraine needs, first of all, the institutional reforms, and in this sphere, we hope very much for the EU integration process, that introduction of EU laws and procedures will improve the institutions in Ukraine, but of course the judicial reform is the important homework that Ukraine will need to do. There is the suggestion about a designated agency that will lead the reconstruction process, and it should be something similar to Marshall Plan agency that was active in Europe in 1947 and afterwards. It will be important to attract private capital, and to do this, we will need war insurance, some kind of war insurance, and the Ukrainian government is already discussing this kind of arrangement with the World Bank, which has its mega agency But of course, the most important issue will be rebuilding human capital, and this means providing for lost years of education, massive reskilling of the labor force, because obviously the economy will restructure and new skills will be needed, while some of the skills will become obsolete and so on. So this will be one of the very important and very complex tasks. And it actually can start already now. For example, some of my friends and colleagues here in the UX already started helping Ukrainian scientists and Ukrainian researchers who stay in Ukraine. They are providing them with some fellowships, some allowances, so that these researchers can continue their research and preserve their human capital. But of course, the necessary condition is minimization of damage, which can be achieved by obviously making Ukrainian victory faster and closer. Here, everyone can help. Of course, Ukrainians are donating a lot to the Ukrainian army, to some volunteer organizations who help Ukrainian army and so on. But you can imagine, as the economy contracts, Ukrainians lose ability to donate. Therefore, they are always asking for international assistance with regard to that. I can announce that on December 7th, there will be the publication of the CAPR book, where we provide an extensive discussion of these and other ideas for Ukraine's reconstruction. So you will be able to read this book. It will be open for everyone. Thank you. And if you have any questions, I'm ready to answer.
Maybe I have a question. So recently there were news, for example, that some Western companies, like even Apple, made it to the headlines, were very much afraid to continue operations right now, right? So some of these companies already had operations, but they sort of started freezing it in Ukraine and didn't dare to hire new people, for example. What's your view actually on this? Like, should, when it comes, for example, to hiring new people in Ukraine, is it better for especially foreign investors to hire Ukrainians outside of the physical Ukraine, like, for example, in the neighboring countries, as many do at the moment? Or would you rather recommend to actually hire people inside of Ukraine?
Well, if the choice is like between a person who is in Ukraine and who is outside Ukraine, I would recommend hiring someone who is inside Ukraine, because, as you know, men are prohibited from leaving the country, and since unemployment is very high, this remote work is in fact the only opportunity for many people to earn some money and, you know, to support the economy. And of course, they will donate some part of this money for Ukrainian army and for providing for the army. Of course, I understand that with the destruction of electricity, this may be risky for foreign companies to hire people remotely, but Ukrainians are actually solving this problem. They are buying generators, accumulators, Starlinks, and so on. For example, in Kiev, many co-workings were open that offer uninterrupted internet and electricity from generators and this kind of things. So unfortunately, we need to become very good at adjusting